so we're getting close to wrapping things up, but we don't want to leave without talking about vegetables. This is the season for vegetable gardening. I'm sure, or I hope that many of you have your veggies planted already. I know it was a wet spring and that can be challenging, but we have quite a few questions here on vegetable gardening, and I believe Natalie and Melody are going to kind of help us out on getting some of these questions answered this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So you already mentioned that we're kind of coming through a rather wet spring, and I think a couple of the questions that we actually have pea questions, Melody. I mean, how often do you get pea questions? Like, it's not terribly often, but yeah. So there were actually a couple that were yellowing plants and browning roots or very poor vigor on the pea plants. So I'm thinking, environmental disease kind of combination there. Where would you go with that, Melody?
Yeah, I agree. I think which I'm not sure where this person is at, but with the with the weather conditions like they've been, and as we've really started to warm up, we're going to start to see more of that stress. And a lot of that's just going to be weather and climate related, I think, probably more so than disease, just based on what they say.
Yeah. And peas are challenging in our climate because we have a variable spring and it warms up, and then we stress out those cool season crops. There are some kind of root rot complexes that affect our pea bean species. So good drainage, crop rotation is important, because when we think about it, could be fusarium, there's pythium, there's a range of those options. And while seed treatment can help maybe for the damping off very early in the season, is probably not going to have much of an effect when you talk about the more root rot types of issues. So, good environmental conditions, good rotation, good drainage.
Awesome. So let's see. Oh, I like this question. I'm going to ask you ladies. So this came in the question portal. Do marigolds actually help with garden pests as far as prevention? Do they? No, we hear a lot about these quote unquote companion planting plans. What does the science say?
Okay, as far as science, there is some benefit with a specific cultivar, which is the French marigolds. Okay, Tagetes pallidum. Natalie, I don't know if I said that right. But the roots actually exude a toxin that can repel nematodes. So that is a great benefit. We see this from gardens all over, especially in the South, that folks do that as a companion, because it draws in pollinators, but it also draws in those beneficial insects like hoverflies and wasp that you actually see like laying their eggs on hornworms. So they can do that. They attract those good beneficials that we want to do good. But you have to remember that we don't have a lot of scientific evidence that really supports all of that. But if you want to plant marigolds, they absolutely cannot hurt, and they do add a bright splash of color. If nematodes or what we call roundworms are an issue, LSU, I know, has done some extensive research on that. So just make sure that, again, that they are the French marigolds, the ones that are really, really stinky and darker in color. You can actually smell that. Very, very great smell, huh, Celeste?
I love that stink. I love that marigold stink.
So Celeste knows that marigolds are like not my favorite plant, but putting them in with tomatoes, okay. So yeah, and Melody was mentioning, there is about root knot nematode and marigolds. The challenge when we think about companion planting is we want to put something in there that improves the whole area around it. And so when we think about a plant that can negatively impact root knot nematodes because of its own, secondary metabolites, that's not going to like benefit the entire bed, right? It's not very altruistic. Marigold is helping itself reduce the root knot nematodes, but it may not be reducing root knot nematodes in the entire bed. So that's kind of we do have lots of root knot nematode resistant or tolerant tomatoes. And so we start to think about a multifaceted approach. And I think that when we talk about kind of the sustainable methods, there is not just one silver bullet. So we want to bring together all of those combined methods for the benefit of our growing areas.
So thank you, ladies. We have another question here, still in that tomato vein. So I know that's the sweet spot for you, Natalie. And I thought this is a good one to bring for everybody to hear today. Can indeterminate tomato plants be trimmed? I think they meant to say determinate, but the question says, can indeterminate tomato plants be trimmed, right, or pruned, and still produce tomatoes? And obviously, I think the answer is yes, but I think what they meant to say is, can determinate tomatoes be pruned and still produce?
Right. So indeterminate tomatoes continue to produce side shoots, leaves, blooms throughout the course of the growing season. Determinate have a small mutation that terminates their growth at a certain point. So many of our common slicers are determinate, and that means that all of their side branches, the suckers, are going to be very crucial for their fruit production because they're going to just have a limited top growth. So oftentimes what we'll do is remove just a couple or three of the side shoots from the bottom for disease, for airflow, but we'll leave on a lot of those side shoots in the middle part of the canopy because of their importance for fruit production. Indeterminates, Melody, you want to talk about our heirloom indeterminate options?
Indeterminate, yeah, they just keep growing and growing and growing. Okay, y'all get where I'm going with that. So they will produce all the way up to frost. Just like Natalie said, though, we can still prune off a lot of that on the bottom part of that plant, again, because airflow is going to be critical to just help us resist, especially fungal diseases. Keep that air moving through, though. And you don't need to have a lot of that foliage, because we want to push a lot more of that energy in that plant to the actual fruit production anyway. So keeping as much of that pruned down below even that first flowering fruit cluster is ideal on those indeterminate tomato plants.
Yeah, so leaves, of course, we know, produce photosynthase and sugars. And as a general statement, they're going to move those photosynthase down. So having a whole lot of leaf material that is underneath our fruiting clusters, like we don't have a lot of sugar that's moving up. So that allows us to, and that's how we manage, in a greenhouse or a hydroponic system, we just continue to kind of bring up that canopy as the plant grows because we're getting the most production from our leaves immediately above our currently maturing fruit cluster.
Okay, so again, we're pretty tomato heavy, but I mean, like I said, we're in the middle of gardening season, and tomato is like the one of the most important plants in most of our vegetable gardens. So we're going to spend a lot of time on. And we have a question here in the portal that's talking about they're having some issues with their tomato plants. This is the second year in a row that they've had these issues. They're saying that the leaves curl up on the top and the growth is stunted. And they did mention in here that they are using chicken litter from their chicken house to put on the garden. They have sampled the soil and everything. It says that everything is okay as far as being balanced. And so, I mean, there are lots of ways that we can go on this. We could talk about the importance of knowing where composted manure comes from and what the animals have been eating. I'm just going to let y'all take that into whichever areas you want to go into.
I'll start off with that one because since you just said that, Celeste, that is an issue. We often say that tomatoes, and I see this a lot here in Northeast Tennessee, folks will bring in samples of beautiful foliage, lush green growth, but they have no fruit. And oftentimes that's because we have too high nitrogen in that soil. And oftentimes that's going to be a result of that compost or the manure that we call too hot. So it's just really heavy on the nitrogen. We don't want to be pushing nitrogen. We're going to do that on corn because that's technically a grass. We're going to do that on brassicas because we're eating that leafy green. But when it comes to tomato plants, we want to back off on that nitrogen. We want to focus more on P and K because that's what's going to push that fruit production. So if you are utilizing a manure or a compost, make sure it's, dried down, composted well. Sorry, Celeste, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, in our soil samples, our soil lab doesn't test for levels of nitrogen in the soil. It tests for P and K, and nitrogen is based on the need the nitrogen need of the crop that you submit along with your sample. So, they're not testing for excess nitrogen because in our native soils, nitrogen is not held. So there's no reason to test for it. But if you're adding something that has high levels of nitrogen, right, things might look fine on your soil sample.
Yeah, very good point. But just always be careful to make sure that you're utilizing composted. And Natalie, one more thing, and I'll let you get into the disease and stuff. When I hear that, another thing that we're seeing a lot of this year is when you said that about the curling on the top of the tomatoes, you'd have to really be able to eyeball that to know for sure. But we see a lot of herbicide injury, especially with phenoxy-based herbicides. The benzene like dicamba or 2,4-D, and even now, also hearing you talk about chicken manure. I know a lot of folks are using straw that they're purchasing somewhere else. We could even have an herbicide like aminopyralid. I know that's a big word, and I don't want to throw that at you, but that is some issues in regards to purchasing compost manure or straw from outside sources. We don't know where that's coming from, and that herbicide carryover or drift. Because 2,4-D, a phenoxy-based herbicide, can volatilize and move off target for miles, especially if we get into really high humid temperatures. So be very careful with that. Not saying necessarily that you applying that chemical, again, that can move for miles. So just be real cautious with that. And if you have concern with the way they're curling up on the ends, they can almost take on a rubbery appearance. Almost get yellow, kind of tough feeling. Make sure you call your county agent and get an accurate diagnosis on that, because often that's what we're going to see this time of year. So
yeah. So we talked about nitrogen, we talked about the potential for herbicide, and the other thing that I would throw in there is that, and Melody mentioned this, but anytime that we are talking about animal manures, we want to make sure that those are well composted, because we want to mitigate any food safety risk when we use those in a fresh, raw produce type of situation like vegetables. And so sometimes in our home systems, well, oftentimes, as a general rule in our home systems, we are not going to be able to get high enough consistent temperatures to most safely deal with some potential pathogens in animal manure. So I say that to say that oftentimes it would be our general kind of, conservative or best recommendation to focus on composting plant-based materials and then use composted animal residues from a facility where we know we can get the size and the volume to get those temperatures up. And that also in many ways kind of protects you from what could be those variable levels of nitrogen from using a hot source like a chicken litter.
Hey, Melody, along those lines, my daughter sent me pictures the other day about her tomatoes curling in her raised bed in her subdivision, and it was oxen, so it was herbicide damage. She said, but Dad, I didn't spray any. I said, your neighbors did.
Somebody else's lawn, yeah. And tomatoes are the canary in the well when it comes to herbicide types of damage. And I mean, probably all of us, I know I have this week, have gotten curled up tomato pictures in my email.
A thing to keep in mind is, I don't know if it's just me or what, but it sure just seems like that this spring has been an awfully windy spring as compared to some in the past. And I know at my house, I have curled some leaves on some tomato plants this spring, and I was making an application 500 feet away. And I'm pretty sure it was self-inflicted, but yeah.
It seemed like every time I went out to put out pre-emergent or do any type of spraying this year, it was too windy. So yeah, definitely been a windy year.
The temperature can have a big effect on the volatilization of those too.
Well, all right. Well, I feel like that's a great way to wrap things up for today. I appreciate everybody coming on and submitting questions and being active in the chat box. And we hope that you got some valuable information from our office hours today. And Sustainable Landscape Work Group, would y'all like to have any parting comments?
Be on the lookout for ticks. I've had my first run-in with ticks this year already, so be vigilant.
This is a perfect time to scout your yard. If you've got disease, it will be in the month of June. So get out and scout your yard and make some notes.
Preventive fungicides for your vegetables.
Yeah, same with your garden. keep notes. What you have trouble with this year will rear its ugly head next year, and you can be more proactive.
And when the label says spray every 7 days, spray every 7 days.
So lots of good things for everybody to be keeping their eyes out, looking for, being conscious of what's going on in your landscapes and around those areas. And so I think that's all that or is that all we have for today? I think that's all we have for today.
Yeah, I think perfect timing, boss.
All right. So the next time that we're gonna do office hours, I think, Natalie, is it in August or September?
I think it's August.
Yeah, August.
First Friday in August.
So we'll be sending out reminders. We've had a great time, and we hope everybody comes back and joins us again. Remember, this is it for everybody. You don't have to be a master gardener to join in on our Friday office hours. So share this with friends. All right. Y'all have a good one.
All right. Have a great weekend.